All right, before we look at our two main examples of wars in the High and Late Middle Ages, that would be the Crusades and the Hundred Years' War, I wanted to follow up on the last video, which was about the Peace of God movement, to show the changing sensibilities when it came to being a warrior in a predominantly Christian world. If we recall, the Peace of God movement was, this reaction against the endemic violence of the post-Carolingian period in Europe. It put severe limitations on how often and specifically when people could fight. It imposed penalties, pretty severe penalties, at least when it came to a kind of spiritual and eternal significance, on people who fought illegitimately or for their own selfish ends, or who broke the peace, as it were. And so, all of this is an important background for understanding the actions of Christian warriors in this period and the way that they conceived of themselves. At the same time, and I did mention this, warriors were privileged, right? We're talking here about nobles. The conception of medieval society was that it was organized into three orders. Those who fought, known in Latin as the bellatores, those who prayed, known in Latin as the oratores, and those who worked, known in Latin as the laboratores. The bellatores were not only those who fought, but also those who ruled. And so this is a privileged group of people. Just as privileged, or even more privileged than the prayers, the monks and the priests and the religious people, and certainly a great deal more privileged than the laboratores, the workers who made up the vast majority of the population, right? And so, they had their own mentalities, even their own forms of entertainment. They had really their own society. And in that society and in the culture that accompanied that society, we can start to detect through things like the literature of this period. The literature not written in Latin, which was predominantly religious in nature, but rather the literature that was written in the vernacular, meaning the actual spoken languages of Europe in this period. Language or literature written in French, literature written in Italian, literature written in Spanish, literature written in German, literature written in English, though not the modern versions of these, right? We're talking about Old French and Middle High German and Middle English, and so forth and so on. Okay. So that literature was produced, for the most part, in the royal and noble courts of Europe. And by court, we don't mean court of law. We mean the social arrangements of the royals and the nobles. Courts would take place, or they would... the site for these was like a castle, okay, where the royals and the nobles would gather together. They would, there were conventions associated with this. Often lower nobles would be in attendance at a court of a higher noble. I don't want to get into the intricacies of this and get lost in the weeds so much. But in these courts, they had forms of entertainment. They had hired professional storytellers who composed texts that were performed. And so this was originally oral literature, though it was written down over time. And in these stories, we can find some of the best information about the way that the people who inhabited these spaces, meaning the knights and the ladies, and people like kings and dukes and counts and barons and so forth and so on, right? The way that they thought about themselves, the way they conceived of their own identities. It's understandable, given the audience, that most of these tales, in fact, almost without exception, are about knights. They're about warriors. But there are serious changes in this literature over time. In the earliest European literature, in the vernacular, most of the stories are pretty straightforward. They're just tales about war. They imitate the epics of the ancient world. We read earlier in the course, some excerpts from the Aeneid. You may at some point in your life have read some of the Iliad or the Odyssey. These are similar. A good example of this type of literature is a text that was originally composed in Old French. Here we have a translation of part of this. It's called the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. And this was written down probably in the late 11th, early 12th century, but it may date from a century or so before that. It is a story about Charlemagne, or at least about some of the warriors in the army of Charlemagne. And there was a whole collection of tales told about Charlemagne that kind of grew in the telling of them. A corpus of stories that were cycled and recycled through the courts of Europe. This is the most famous of these. The story of the Song of Roland it takes place in the Spanish campaign of Charlemagne. This was a campaign during his reign where he took an army south of the Pyrenees down into Spain, which was controlled mostly by Muslims at the time, and managed to carve out a little territory and created an entity there known as the Spanish March, which is roughly coterminous with modern Catalonia. It would later become the Kingdom of Aragon and other things in the Middle Ages. So this is northeastern Spain, Barcelona being the most significant city in that region. And according to the tale told in the Song of Roland, and this can be corroborated in other sources, the rear guard of Charlemagne's army, as it was headed back north of the Pyrenees, the rear guard was ambushed. Now, it seems in the actual historical event, this ambush was by kind of separatist rebels who were probably Basques. But in the telling of this, it changed such that they became Muslims. And that sort of made sense. When people envisioned medieval Spain, they saw this as a territory of war and competition between Christians and Muslims. And the story is pretty straightforward, right? It starts out with the leader of the rear guard, whose name is Roland. Here, his name is given as Rollans, which is the original Old French. They didn't modify it. And he is together with his best friend, right-hand man, Olivier, or Oliver. And the other main character in this is an archbishop whose name is Turpin. And these are kind of the main characters in this rear guard of Charlemagne. And at the beginning of the story here, or at least this excerpt that we have, Oliver looks out and he sees an ambush coming. Okay. He describes them as pagans, but, in the Middle Ages, people thought that Muslims were actually like remnants of old paganism. I don't want to get into the details of that. And there's this massive army of pagans. Oliver says, pagans in force abound, well of us Franks, but very few I count. He's worried about this, and he asks Roland to sound his horn. And if Charlemagne hears, he'll turn his armies round. And Roland says, no, I'm not going to sound my horn like some coward, right? This is my chance to win everlasting fame and glory. And with Durendal, he says, Durendal is his sword. They tended to name their swords in these stories. I'll lay on thick and stout and blood the blade to its golden hilt I'll drown. Felon pagans to the past shall not come down. I pledge you now to death, they all are bound, right? And Oliver tries to talk him into blowing his horn a few more times, but finally, we get to the point where both of them decide, okay, right, we're going to fight here, right? We are outnumbered. The odds are against us, but we're going to fight. From both of them, pride hath Roland's, wisdom Oliver hath, and both of them show marvelous courage once they are horsed, once they have donned their arms, rather they die than from the battle pass, right? Here we get into the noble warrior sensibilities. I mean, this is a fight. This is my chance to win fame and glory, and I'm going to do it, right? Much of the rest of this story is about the combat. There is a bit where the archbishop kind of says a prayer over them and tells them they are all forgiven of their sins and all of this, and that in fighting against the Saracens, it's another medieval word for Muslims, they will gain God's grace, right? in addition to their fame, right? And so they are blessed by God, so to speak. They are their war is sanctioned by him. This gets us back into the notion of just war. Well, this is a just war, right? They're fighting against infidels. And then the rest of this pretty much is just like fighting, right? The action goes from one warrior to another. We get a lot of Roland and Oliver, and even Turpin, the archbishop, puts on armor and a horse, and jumps on a horse and joins the fight. Okay, but even some of the minor warriors, some of the other men, right, their exploits are told a bit here, and they all get killed, but they thwart the ambush. And we get the closing scene is Roland in his with his dying breath basically says, right, gentle count, conquering he was slain, right? I did what I could, and I did what any warrior would want to do, and that is die in battle. And the medieval audiences, the courtly audiences who listened to this absolutely ate this up. Like this was their ideal. This was their dream, right? To win everlasting fame and glory on the battlefield, to die for a good cause, to die defending Christianity and all of that, right? But there's not a lot of character development here. There's not a lot of depth of the story. It's just a story of war. Understand, it's the equivalent, really, of a modern blockbuster film directed by somebody like Michael Bay, right, with lots of explosions and special effects and all of that, but with very little character development. Over time, the literature changed. Some of this almost certainly was in response to the desires of women who were also resident at the court. They likely developed a distaste for, the stories of war and bloodshed, or maybe they just wanted something else. By the second half of the 12th century, we have a different kind of story about nobles and warriors being written. And the earliest significant character in this, though, there are mentions of earlier poets who did some of the same thing, but the earliest significant texts come from a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes, who composed 5 texts that have survived, and probably many more that haven't. He was a hired poet serving at the court of a queen named Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's an interesting character in her own right. She was originally married to the King of France, and then ended up annulling that marriage and marrying the King of England. But even served as a duchess in her own right in her home country of Aquitaine, which is in kind of southern France. And Eleanor was a cultivator of poets and of literature. She was a patroness of that. But the poets in her employ seem to have responded to her desires to hear a different kind of story. And so, whereas the Song of Roland is part of the epic genre, the stories of Chrétien de Troyes and some of those who follow would fit under the genre of romance. Now, we shouldn't think of like Harlequin, bodice ripper sorts of romances here, okay, though this is the forerunner of that. The main characters in romance are still knights. But these knights are inspired not by a lust for fame and glory, and bloodshed, but rather out of love for the women in their lives. And it's in this transition that we can sense perhaps the influence of the peace of God, where warriors have to be more circumspect about when they fight and for what reason they fight. We can see here, the just war theory having its effect as well, that the war must be, or the battle must be justified in some way. And again, we can also see, I think, the influence of, these women who are asking for, first of all, female characters in these stories, and really different motivations of characters, right? One of Chrétien's stories is the original story of the knight Lancelot, and these are all Arthurian tales, or at least most of them are. There's one of his that isn't, but most of his take place in the court of King Arthur. Now, this is a French poet writing about an English king, but nevertheless, right, the Arthur character was quite famous all over Europe. But Lancelot in this tale is in love with the queen. This love, however, is chaste, at least initially, because it inspires Lancelot. It's okay for this knight to love a woman he cannot, at least legitimately, attain. Okay? Because the love drives him to do great things. And in this story, and in fact, Chrétien, in writing at the beginning of the tale, he says, I am writing this because I love a woman, and I dedicate this to her. This woman happens to be, as he says, my Lady of Champagne. This is Marie de Champagne, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So she's a countess in her own right. She's married. But he says, I'm doing this for her, right? In a way, the nobles here, and Chrétien himself seems to be a participant, are playing games with love. They're messing around with the whole concept of love. They are introducing love as a factor in people's lives. Marriage did not happen because of love. At least that was not any legitimate reason for it in the Middle Ages, particularly among nobles. Like, marriage was for political reasons and, for the sake of joining property and those sorts of things, right? Love is for a different reason. This is not a love that necessarily can be consummated. Chrétien could not legitimately, right, consummate his relationship with Marie de Champagne. He probably would have lost his head had he done that. Lancelot was not supposed to consummate his relationship with Guinevere. In some stories he does, and that leads to all sorts of hand-wringing over this and concern that they have done something illegitimate and that has damaged the kingdom. But, in short, right, the knights are now more complex characters. They're not just bloodthirsty warriors on the battlefield. Their motivations are different. And this story gets into delicious details about where that love leads them. For instance, there at one point in the story, and this is this section, Lancelot arrives at a castle. He is exhausted. He is kind of out of leads and seeking Guinevere. Guinevere's been kidnapped, by the way, by a rogue knight. And Lancelot has gone after her, right? Arthur doesn't go after her himself because he has the kingdom to attend to. He's really married to the kingdom. Lancelot's the one who loves Guinevere, and he goes after her. And that motivation drives him to do great things. In this case, this woman says, well, yes, I can give you lodging for the night, but you have to then fulfill a request that I have. Lancelot, as a good knight, obeying the rules of chivalry, which were in development at this point, cannot refuse a request. And this woman says, okay. And he says, fine, yes, I will do whatever you want. And she says, okay, my terms are you need to sleep with me. And then Lancelot's like caught in the middle of this, right? And it gets even worse because as he's sort of stewing over this, he hears the woman scream and he goes in and it looks like she's being raped by a couple of other knights, and he has to then defend her and risk his own life for a woman he doesn't love to prove himself worthy for the woman he does love. And then if he does this, he's probably going to have to sleep with her, which would be a betrayal of his love, and it gets so complicated. And it later turns out that she set the whole thing up to kind of prove him. But you have to ask, to whom would such a story appeal? And to see a knight like this kind of wriggle at the end of a hook, caught, in this trap. And the details are just delicious, right? It's almost certain that the women in the audience would have delighted in these sorts of things, okay? Much like a good romantic comedy perhaps is appealing to the same kind of audience today. I don't want to be stereotypical about things necessarily. There are some great physical deeds. Lancelot has to cross a bridge made out of a sword, for instance, and he cuts his feet up and stuff like that, but he doesn't even feel it because of the love he has for Guinevere, and then he's finally united with her. This isn't necessarily a sexual consummation, okay? But his love drives him to that, and he's willing to do anything for her, even suffer social humiliation. That's actually a big deal about this tale, is that Lancelot has to undergo humiliation because he loves Guinevere. At one point he's in a tournament and he's fighting, and Guinevere sends him a message and says, I want you to lose for a while. I want you to do badly. And Lancelot has to risk, the disapproval and even the humiliation in the face of others, but he does it. He stops winning. He stops fighting well. And then she finally sends him a message and she says, okay, now do your best, right? And of course he's inspired by her to do that. All right, so those are some texts that you can kind of chew on, take a look at these things, think about what this means for the concept of war in the Middle Ages, and we can have further discussion about it.